The grand chandelier of the Crystal Ballroom in the heart of New York City cast a fractured, brilliant glow over the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Chloe Vance maneuvered through the crowded floor with a heavy silver tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips, her posture flawlessly straight, despite the searing ache in her lower back. She was 24 years old, and for the past 2 years she had been a ghost, in a black and white uniform, invisible to the billionaires, politicians, and socialites who gathered for these exclusive charity galas. She despised the work with every fiber of her being, but desperation had a way of silencing pride. Every glass of champagne she served, every condescending glance she endured, translated into funds that kept her mother's medical treatments going and maintained the tiny, drafty apartment they shared in the distant outskirts of Queens. The uniform she wore, severe and starched, was designed to erase individuality. Her thick dark hair was pulled back into a painfully tight bun, secured with a single unadorned golden hairpin. She kept her eyes cast downward, navigating the room with a subservient grace, trained to never interrupt the conversations of the elite. Yet her fellow waitresses, like young Sarah, who often complained about the cruelty of the guests, noticed that Chloe moved differently. There was an unspoken rhythm in her steps, a silent melody in the way she glided past mahogany tables and velvet chairs. None of the wealthy patrons demanding their glasses be refilled could ever imagine that the efficient hands pouring their expensive, sparkling wine had once executed breathtaking leaps and pirouettes that brought audiences at the grandest theaters to tears. They only saw a servant a backdrop to their opulent lives, completely unaware of the dormant fire burning beneath her quiet exterior. The murmurs of the wealthy guests blended with the soft ambient melodies provided by a string quartet in the corner of the vast room. Chloe stood near a marble pillar waiting for her next set of orders, allowing her mind to drift far from the suffocating atmosphere of the New York Gala. Whenever the physical toll of her grueling shifts became unbearable, she would retreat into the sanctuary of her memories, back to a time when her body was an instrument of pure art rather than a vessel for manual labor. The contrast between her current reality and her glorious past was a bitter pill she swallowed every single night, a silent sacrifice made in the name of familial love. She watched the women in their designer dresses attempting to dance their movements stiff and uninspired, and she could not help but remember the feeling of true flight, the absolute freedom that came with abandoning oneself to the music on a brightly lit stage. The memories always began in the small, rustic town of Pine Grove, Pennsylvania, where the air smelled of pine needles and fresh rain, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes of New York City. Chloe had been a child, possessed by an endless, restless energy, constantly twirling through the narrow hallways of her family's modest home. When she was 5 years old, her mother, Catherine, decided to channel that boundless vitality into something structured, enrolling her in a beginner ballet class at the local community center. The studio was humble, with scuffed wooden floors and a single wall of mirrored glass, but to young Chloe, it was a magical realm. Her first teacher, Madame Helena, a retired dancer who had once graced the stages of Philadelphia, immediately recognized a rare raw spark in the little girl whose head barely reached the wooden bar. Helena saw not just physical flexibility, but an innate, profound connection to the music, an emotional depth that could not be taught. Realizing that the community center could not nurture such a monumental gift, Helena made a phone call to a talent scout she knew from the prestigious New York Ballet Academy, urging him to visit the rural town. When the scout arrived in Pennsylvania, it took him less than 10 minutes of watching Chloe move to understand that he was witnessing the dawn of a prodigy. At just 8 years old, Chloe's life was irrevocably altered. She bid a tearful farewell to the quiet streets of Pine Grove and moved to the towering, intimidating metropolis of New York City, armed with a full scholarship that generously covered her rigorous tuition, safe lodging, and daily living expenses. Her parents, Charles and Catherine, remained in their rural hometown, working tirelessly and saving every spare dime for weeks just to afford the monthly train ticket to the city to visit their daughter. During those precious weekend visits, they would watch in sheer awe as their little girl transformed into an ethereal creature, a being of light and shadow who seemed to effortlessly defy the laws of gravity whenever she leapt across the rehearsal studio. The sacrifices were immense. The physical pain of blistered toes and aching muscles was constant, but Chloe's ascent through the ranks of the academy was nothing short of meteoric. By the time she turned 18 years old, Chloe had achieved the coveted rank of soloist, making her the youngest dancer to attain such a position in the recent history of the elite company. Her technique was flawless, her emotional expression devastatingly beautiful. At 20 years old, she was crowned prima ballerina. The harshest critics in the city penned glowing reviews comparing her breathtaking performances to the legendary figures of classical dance. Exclusive invitations flooded in, requesting her presence as a guest star in the most revered ballet companies across London, Paris, and Rome. Her face adorned cultural magazines. Her name was whispered with reverence in artistic circles. Her future appeared as a brilliant constellation, seemingly etched in stone, as inevitable and glorious as a golden sunrise over the city skyline. She was living a dream built on years of blood sweat and relentless dedication, entirely unaware of the storm clouds gathering just beyond the horizon. But fate, in its infinite and often cruel mystery, has a tendency to extinguish the brightest stars without a moment of warning, proving that even the most solid stones can be shattered into dust. The tragedy struck exactly 2 years ago on a mundane Tuesday morning that began like any other. Her father, Charles, a man whose gentle smile had always been Chloe's anchor, suffered a massive sudden heart attack while standing in the small sunlit kitchen of their Pennsylvania home. He collapsed to the linoleum floor while preparing a simple breakfast. He would never get to eat, his heart failing him before the ambulance could even turn down their street. The sudden loss was a devastating blow, but the true nightmare began in the days following the somber, rain-soaked funeral. As Chloe and her mother sorted through the paperwork, they unearthed a mountain of hidden debts, a string of failed investments and desperate loans that Charles had kept secret to protect his family's peace of mind. The financial ruin was absolute, and the grief was insurmountable. Catherine, unable to cope with the sudden death of her soulmate and the terrifying reality of their destitution, spiraled into a depression so dark and profound that she attempted to end her own life, landing in a psychiatric care facility with mounting medical bills. Suddenly, the glittering world of grand theaters, velvet curtains, and standing ovations was violently ripped away from Chloe. The universe presented her with an agonizing, impossible ultimatum: continue her glorious career on the stage, or save the fragile life of the woman who had brought her into the world. In truth, it was never really a choice. The decision was instinctual, born of a fierce, protective love, even though the sheer agony of walking away from her destiny still woke her in the dead of night, her pillow soaked with silent tears. Chloe marched into the director's office, resigned from the company, and sold everything of value she possessed, from her designer gowns to her custom point shoes. She packed her shattered life into a few suitcases, moved her fragile mother into a cramped, affordable apartment on the edges of Queens, and sought employment in the only sector that hired quickly and paid in cash tips. The celebrated prima ballerina morphed into a nameless, faceless servant, a woman whom society expected to remain invisible, pouring drinks for the ultra-wealthy, while they carried on their glamorous lives, completely oblivious to the tragedy of the fallen star walking among them. The transition from a revered artist to an ignored laborer was a daily exercise in profound humility. Chloe learned to swallow her pride, when guests snapped their fingers at her to bite her tongue, when drunken socialites spilled wine on her uniform, and blamed her for their clumsiness. She built a fortress around her heart, locking away the music, the lights and the applause focusing solely on survival. Her fellow waitress Sarah often marveled at Chloe's stoic endurance, asking how she managed to maintain such dignified composure in the face of such blatant disrespect. Chloe would simply offer a sad, knowing smile, replying that everyone had their burdens to carry. She had traded the standing ovations of the theater for the steady hum of hospital monitors, finding a different, quieter kind of heroism in the sacrifices she made for her mother's healing. Yet the dancer inside her never truly died. She merely slept, waiting in the shadows of the banquet halls, preserving her grace for a moment that Chloe believed would never come again. On the opposite end of the spectrum of human existence stood Alexander Montgomery. He was exactly what his tailored Italian suits and diamond cufflinks suggested, a staggeringly arrogant heir who had never worked a single day in his opulent life, a man who viewed the working class as nothing more than animated furniture placed on earth for his convenience. At 30 years old, Alexander had inherited the entirety of his late father's massive real estate empire, a fortune so vast it allowed him to drift through life completely shielded from consequence or struggle. He spent his days curating a collection of imported luxury sports cars, discarding designer-clad girlfriends when he grew bored and basking in the hollow admiration of sycophants who desperately hoped to catch a few crumbs of his immense wealth. His worldview was frighteningly narrow, defined entirely by price tag's status, and the cruel amusement he derived from asserting his dominance over those he deemed inferior. On this particular evening at the Crystal Plaza Charity Gala, Alexander was suffocating from sheer boredom. He stood near the extravagant ice sculpture with his two closest companions, Brad and Chase, swirling a glass of aged whiskey and scanning the room with deeply cynical eyes. It was the same predictable crowd, the same aging politicians reciting empty promises, the same calculating women approaching him with bright artificial smiles, silently plotting to secure a diamond engagement ring he had absolutely no intention of ever purchasing. The conversations were agonizingly dull, revolving around stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. Alexander sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, desperate for some form of genuine entertainment to break the monotonous luxury of the evening. It was precisely at that moment of supreme aristocratic boredom that his piercing gaze landed on a waitress meticulously clearing empty champagne flutes from a nearby table. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, an anomaly in the rigid machinery of the catering staff. Alexander could not immediately identify what it was, but he found himself unable to look away. Perhaps it was the mesmerizing fluidity with which she moved, a quiet, commanding grace that seemed entirely out of place for someone wearing a servant's apron. Or perhaps it was her face, strikingly beautiful, in a pure, unadorned, natural manner that the women in his elite social circle, with all their expensive cosmetic surgeries and endless spa treatments, could never hope to emulate. She worked with an intense, quiet dignity, her eyes focused on her task, completely ignoring the wealth and power surrounding her. To Alexander, whose entire existence relied on being noticed and revered, her complete indifference was both an insult and a challenge. His predatory instincts flared to life, viewing the quiet waitress not as a human being with a soul and a history, but as a temporary plaything to alleviate the tediousness of the high society ball. Alexander's friends, trained to read his moods and eager to participate in his cruel games, noticed the direction of his intense stare and immediately began their chorus of mockery. Brad leaned in, adjusting his silk tie, and chuckled, suggesting that Alexander should invite the miserable girl to dance, just to see the panicked look on her face. Chase laughed loudly, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the refined atmosphere, adding that a girl from the slums would probably trip over her own oversized apron before she even reached the center of the room. The toxic combination of expensive alcohol-crushing boredom and the inherent cruelty of extreme privilege fueled Alexander's dark inspiration. He decided in a split second of arrogant malice that it would be hilariously entertaining to publicly humiliate the beautiful waitress, to tear down that quiet dignity and remind her of her place at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. He handed his whiskey glass to Brad, plastered a terrifyingly charming smile of pure superiority on his face, and began to weave his way through the crowd toward the unassuming girl in the black and white uniform. When he reached Chloe, he did not politely ask for her attention. He invaded her space, deliberately standing too close, forcing her to pause her work. He looked her up and down with blatant disrespect, and then, with a theatrical flair designed to draw the attention of the surrounding guests, he delivered the words that would irrevocably alter the course of both their lives. Raising his voice so that the wealthy patrons nearby were forced to stop their conversations and listen, Alexander grandly declared that he would marry her on the spot if she could dance better than any of the refined, educated ladies present in the grand ballroom. It was a vicious, calculated wager engineered specifically to shame her, to invite the entire room to laugh at the utterly absurd notion that a lowly servant could ever compete with women who had been subjected to expensive private dance tutors since they could walk. The trap was set, designed to either force her to run away in tears or stand frozen in humiliating silence. The reaction of the elite crowd was immediate and entirely predictable. The guests who overheard the cruel proposition erupted into a wave of polite but venomous laughter, the kind of condescending amusement the high society employs to enforce the rigid boundaries of class and wealth. The women in their silk gowns looked at Chloe with a mixture of faux pity and deep disdain, waiting for the inevitable moment when the poor waitress would blush furiously, drop her silver tray, and flee toward the safety of the kitchen doors, as any normal person in her impossible position would naturally do. But Chloe did not blush, nor did she flinch, nor did she take a single step backward. As the mocking laughter washed over her, something ancient and powerful ignited behind her dark eyes. It was a fierce, blazing fire that had been buried under layers of crushing grief, profound resignation, and daily survival for 2 agonizing years. She slowly lowered the silver tray to the nearest table. She looked directly into Alexander Montgomery's arrogant eyes, completely stripping away the submissive mask she wore for her job. Without a trace of the fear or intimidation, he was so accustomed to seeing Chloe's voice rang out steady and clear, as a silver bell announcing to the stunned billionaire and the surrounding crowd that she accepted his challenge. The collective gasp and subsequent murmur that rippled through the Crystal Plaza ballroom were instantaneous and electric. The wealthy guests exchanged bewildered glances. Some whispered that the poor girl had lost her mind under the pressure, while others assumed she simply did not comprehend the cruel sarcasm of the billionaire's joke. A few cruel individuals leaned in closer, eagerly anticipating what they believed would be the most spectacular, embarrassing spectacle of the social season. Alexander himself blinked rapidly, his confident sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. He was profoundly confused, utterly unsure of how to navigate a situation where his chosen victim completely refused to read from the script of submission he had so carefully drafted. But before he could utter another condescending remark or attempt to laugh off her defiance, Chloe began to move. With slow, incredibly deliberate and hypnotic motions, she reached behind her waist and untied the strings of her stained white apron, letting the fabric fall to the floor like discarded chains. She raised her hands to her head, pulled out the single golden hairpin, and shook her head. allowing her long dark hair to cascade in thick, beautiful waves over her shoulders. With her head held high and a regal dignity that instantly silenced the last lingering pockets of laughter, Chloe walked away from the catering tables and moved toward the polished wooden center of the dance floor. The string quartet in the corner, sensing the drastic shift in the room's atmosphere, trailed off uncertainly. The head of the musical ensemble, Maestro Arthur Pendleton, an elderly gentleman with decades of experience playing for the New York elite, stood at his podium, adjusting his spectacles. He looked toward the center of the floor and saw the young waitress standing there possessing a profound stillness that was not the freezing of stage fright, but the intense gathering concentration of a master about to perform. Alexander, feeling the sudden suffocating weight of hundreds of eyes locked onto him, realized he was losing control of his own cruel game. Desperate to maintain his facade of arrogant amusement, he made a wide, mocking gesture toward Maestro Arthur, loudly demanding the orchestra play something appropriately grand for the servant's inevitable humiliation. Maestro Arthur, though entirely unaware of the young woman's hidden history, possessed an artist's intuition. He sensed the gravity in the girl's posture, the undeniable aura of a performer claiming her rightful space. Bypassing the popular waltzes and light jazz, the elderly conductor raised his baton and chose a piece permanently etched into his soul, signaling his musicians to prepare. He brought the baton down, and the grand weeping notes of the Swan Lake Adagio, arguably the most recognizable and emotionally devastating ballet music in the world, filled the vast ballroom. The first melancholic measures drifted through the crystal chandeliers, speaking of impossible love, profound tragedy, and transcendent beauty. Chloe closed her eyes, absorbing the music, letting it flow into her veins, reawakening muscles and memories that had been starved for 2 years. She took a deep breath, centered her weight, and when she finally opened her eyes and began to move, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. What transpired in the following minutes would be permanently branded into the memories of every single person present in that ballroom, an impossible legend they would recount to their children and grandchildren, even if the listeners refused to believe such magic could exist in the real world. Chloe Vance began to dance, and it was as if time itself had shattered and stopped. The fundamental laws of physics appeared to temporarily suspend their rules, as if gravity had consciously decided to grant an exception solely for this magnificent woman. Her arms rose with the seamless, heartbreaking fluidity of a weeping willow swaying in a gentle breeze, or water tumbling over smooth river stones. Her feet swept across the polished parquet floor as if she possessed absolutely no physical weight. Her entire body merged with the heartbreaking notes of the cello and the violin, becoming the physical manifestation of the music itself, in a manner that none of the wealthy socialites, regardless of how many private lessons they had purchased from the finest instructors in Paris or London, could ever dream of emulating. She was not dancing like a talented amateur who had picked up a few steps in her spare time. She was not dancing like a waitress trying to prove a point. She was dancing exactly as what she truly was, a supreme artist forged in the fires of nearly 20 years of relentless, agonizing training at one of the most elite institutions on the planet. She was a prima ballerina who had commanded the most prestigious stages in Europe and America, who had brought royalty and heads of state to their feet. She was a woman whose immense talent had forced the most cynical critics to compare her to the immortal legends of classical dance. Every single extension was mathematically perfect, yet overflowing with raw, bleeding emotion. Every line her body created told a fragment of the agonizing story of the dying swan, conveying a depth of sorrow and love that mere spoken words could never hope to capture. It was the purest distillation of art, the kind of breathtaking, once-in-a-lifetime performance that only occurs when a human being is born with a divine gift and sacrifices their entire existence to perfect it. The silence inside the grand ballroom was so heavy, so absolute, that one could hear the soft, rhythmic swish of her dark, simple uniform against the wood. They could hear the quiet, perfectly measured intake of her breath as she executed grueling leaps and turns that demanded inhuman strength, yet appeared completely effortless. The wealthy crowd was entirely paralyzed by awe. Alexander Montgomery stood rooted to the spot, his mouth hanging slightly open, his jaw slack. Every ounce of his arrogance, his sickening superiority evaporated into the cold air, second by second. The color violently drained from his face as the horrifying realization crashed over him. He saw the sheer, undeniable majesty of the woman moving before him, and he finally understood the monumental, catastrophic error he had made. He had chosen a sleeping queen as the target of his petty cruelty, and in doing so, he had exposed his own profound, pathetic smallness to the entire world. When the final weeping chord of the violins faded into the heavy air, Chloe sank into a breathtaking, tragic final pose, her head bowed, her chest heaving softly from the immense physical exertion. She held the position for 3 long, agonizing seconds before rising to her feet and executing a perfect, deep, traditional stage reverence. The silence stretched for another moment before the entire room erupted. It was not the polite golf clap applause typical of high society gatherings. It was a deafening, thunderous, genuine standing ovation from hundreds of people who had just been forcefully reminded of what true greatness looked like. Over by the VIP tables, an elderly woman leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane pushed herself up from her chair with visible difficulty and began to walk purposefully toward the center of the room. This was Eleanor Crawford, the formidable matriarch of one of the most historic and powerful families in New York, a legendary patron of the arts, and the former chairwoman of the board for the city's most prestigious ballet company. As she approached Chloe, the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Eleanor's sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto Chloe's flushed face. She recognized her instantly. Her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and reverence carried across the quieted room. Eleanor declared that she had seen Chloe dance the lead in Giselle 3 years prior at the Metropolitan Opera House, a performance so profoundly moving that it had moved the hardened matriarch to uncontrollable tears. She demanded to know with a mixture of outrage and deep sorrow what in God's name a dancer of her unparalleled genius was doing, serving champagne in a catering uniform instead of reigning over the grand stages of the world. A new, entirely different silence descended upon the guests. It was the deeply uncomfortable, shameful silence of a crowd realizing they had brutally misjudged a human being, a stark reminder that outward appearances are often a deceptive mask that can thoroughly humiliate those who believe their wealth makes them superior. Chloe, maintaining the incredible dignity that had defined her performance, briefly explained her situation without a single ounce of self-pity or melodrama. She spoke with the quiet strength of a woman who had accepted the brutal cards life had dealt her even when the game was horribly rigged. She calmly mentioned her father's sudden passing, the crippling debts her mother's severe illness, and the impossible choice she had been forced to make between her brilliant career and the survival of her family. Eleanor Crawford nodded slowly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, recognizing in the young woman a profound, true nobility that she rarely witnessed in the entitled youth of the modern era. She saw genuine sacrifice, fierce familial love, and unbreakable fortitude. Slowly, Eleanor turned her formidable gaze toward Alexander, who was still standing nearby, pale, sweating, and completely mute. With a voice that had effortlessly intimidated senators and ruthless corporate titans for decades, Eleanor publicly reminded Alexander of the loud, arrogant promise he had made just minutes before that he would marry this waitress if she outdanced the ladies of the room. She stared him down, demanding to know if he was a man of honor who stood by his word, or if his promises were as empty, cheap, and meaningless as his entire life of unearned privilege. The ensuing silence was absolutely devastating. Alexander stammered, his voice cracking as he frantically tried to backpedal desperately, claiming it was merely a joke, a simple misunderstanding that no one actually expected him to honor a silly wager made in jest. Every pathetic excuse that tumbled from his lips sounded more cowardly than the last. The guests, who had been eagerly laughing with him earlier, now glared at him with undisguised contempt. In that single defining moment, Alexander lost the one thing his billions could never purchase: the respect of his peers. Before the situation could deteriorate into further ugliness, Chloe intervened. Looking directly at Eleanor, her voice calm and resolute, she stated that she had absolutely no desire to marry a man who treated other human beings with such repulsive cruelty. She declared that she valued her own dignity far more than all the combined wealth in his empire, and that her only true dream was to one day return to the stage when her family's circumstances finally allowed it. Eleanor Crawford smiled, a brilliant, warm expression of a woman who had just discovered a priceless diamond hidden in the mud. She immediately offered Chloe a highly paid, flexible position, directing her massive arts foundation, a role that would provide a generous salary to care for her mother, while keeping her intimately connected to the ballet world she so deeply loved. Furthermore, Eleanor made a solemn public vow, promising before hundreds of witnesses that whenever Chloe felt ready to reclaim her rightful place on the stage, Eleanor would personally tear down every single door required to make it happen. Chloe accepted the offer, her eyes finally overflowing with tears. But these were no longer tears of grief or exhaustion. They were tears of pure, radiant hope, a light that had been dormant for 2 years now roaring back to life. Exactly 365 days later, the grand velvet curtains of the Lincoln Center in New York City slowly rose, revealing Chloe Vance standing in the center of the brilliantly lit stage. The highly anticipated performance was Giselle, the very same tragic, beautiful ballet that Eleanor Crawford had recalled with such deep reverence. As Chloe leaped and spun, interpreting the complex, heartbreaking role of the betrayed peasant girl, she imbued every movement with a profound, shattering emotional depth. It was a depth of performance that can only be achieved by a soul that has walked through the darkest valleys of real agonizing pain and survived to translate that suffering into art. In the center of the front row, wearing an elegant evening gown, sat Eleanor Crawford, beaming with immense pride. Beside the wealthy matriarch sat Catherine, Chloe's mother, her health fully restored, her dark depression vanquished by the healing power of her daughter's boundless love and the financial security they now enjoyed. Throughout the entire performance, both women wept openly, their tears a joyful testament to resilience and triumph. Alexander Montgomery was conspicuously absent. He was not invited to the grand premiere, nor to any of the subsequent sold-out performances. High society had completely ostracized him following that fateful night at the Crystal Plaza. Rumors whispered through the elite circles claimed that the disgraced billionaire watched the live television broadcast of Chloe's glorious return from the crushing solitude of his massive empty penthouse. Surrounded by expensive artwork and luxury items that now brought him absolutely no joy, he was left to endlessly agonize over how his petty, arrogant attempt to publicly humiliate a seemingly defenseless waitress had violently imploded, permanently destroying his own social standing while simultaneously launching the spectacular second era of a true artist's life. Meanwhile, under the blinding warmth of the stage lights, she had once believed were lost to her forever. Chloe danced with the infinite soaring gratitude of a woman who fully understands that life's most profound miracles frequently arrive heavily disguised as moments of deep humiliation, forcing us to reveal our truest, most magnificent selves to a watching world. As the curtain fell that night, the deafening applause echoing through the grand hall carried a profound truth about the human spirit, a lesson that resonates deeply with anyone who has lived long enough to understand the unpredictable tides of fate. Life frequently strips us of our titles, our wealth, and our carefully constructed plans, forcing us into roles we never imagined we would have to play. When we are pushed into the shadows performing thankless tasks to protect the people we love, society may look right through us, judging our worth by the uniform we wear or the struggles we silently bear. However, true nobility is never defined by a bank account, an inherited empire, or the cruel arrogance of those who have never faced genuine adversity. True nobility is forged in the quiet, agonizing sacrifices we make in the dark. It is found in the supreme dignity with which we carry our heaviest burdens, in the refusal to let bitterness extinguish the fire of our inner talents. We all harbor hidden gifts, quiet strengths that remain dormant while we navigate the necessary storms of our existence. When the world attempts to mock or belittle us, it is not a signal to retreat in shame. Rather, it is the universe providing the perfect silent stage for our truest selves to emerge. The arrogance of the privileged is ultimately fragile, easily shattered by the undeniable power of authentic grace and hard-won resilience. Therefore, we must never allow the temporary indignities of our circumstances to define our permanent value. By holding on to our self-respect, honoring our sacrifices, and waiting for the right moment to let our hidden light shine, we discover that the very trials designed to break us are often the exact instruments used to elevate us to heights we never previously imagined. A heart that beats with selfless love and a spirit refined by genuine hardship will always, eventually, command the most magnificent stage of all.